What happens when the world's greatest chef pretends to be nobody? The kitchen gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights, stainless steel surfaces reflecting the nervous faces of 24 contestants lined up like soldiers before battle. This wasn't just any competition. The Lumiere Culinary Championship had launched careers, destroyed reputations, and crowned legends. Camera crews moved like shadows between the cooking stations, capturing every bead of sweat, every trembling hand. At the judges' table sat three titans of the culinary world. Chef Marcus Bellamy, whose restaurants held 12 Michelin stars. Isabelle Rousseau, the food critic who could end careers with a single review. And Kenji Yamamoto, the molecular gastronomy pioneer who had revolutionized modern cuisine. Among the contestants stood a woman who didn't belong. At least, that's what everyone thought. She wore a simple cotton apron over a plain white shirt and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. No designer chef's coat, no custom knives in an expensive leather roll, just a battered canvas bag that had seen better days. Her name tag read Maria Santos in standard block letters, while others around her bore prestigious culinary school emblems and restaurant affiliations. The woman next to her, a tall blonde in a pristine white uniform, glanced over and smirked. The man across the aisle, whose CV listed apprenticeships in Paris and Tokyo, didn't even bother to hide his eye roll. Maria stood perfectly still, her weathered hands resting calmly at her sides, while others fidgeted and stretched, performing elaborate warm-up rituals. Her face revealed nothing, no anxiety, no excitement, no fear. Just a strange, distant calm, like someone watching a play they'd already seen. When the head coordinator called for attention, she didn't lean forward eagerly like the others. She simply waited, her dark eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the judges' table, as if she could see through the walls of the massive competition hall and into some other time, some other place. Chef Bellamy lifted the envelope containing the challenge. The room fell into suffocating silence. "Today's challenge," he announced, his British accent cutting through the tension like a blade, "is deceptively simple. You will prepare a dish that represents home. Not technique, not trends, not what you think we want to see. We want to taste where you come from, who you are, what food means to you at its most fundamental level. You have 3 hours. The pantry is fully stocked. There are no restrictions on ingredients or methods." A murmur rippled through the contestants. Some looked relieved. This seemed easy compared to the technical nightmares they'd anticipated. Others looked terrified, suddenly forced to reveal something personal rather than hide behind practiced skills. But Maria's expression didn't change. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, and when she opened them again, something had shifted. Not in her face, but in the air around her, as if a door had opened to let in wind from somewhere far away. The buzzer screamed. Chaos erupted. Contestants sprinted toward the pantry like shoppers at a clearance sale, grabbing luxury ingredients: Wagyu beef, saffron, white truffles, caviar. The blonde next to Maria's station returned with lobster tails and edible gold leaf. The man across the aisle had secured foie gras and matsutake mushrooms. They were preparing to impress, to dazzle, to prove their sophistication. Maria walked to the pantry at a leisurely pace, seemingly unbothered by the frenzy. She emerged 5 minutes later carrying simple items: tomatoes, onions, garlic, dried beans, a small chicken, rice, plantains, and surprisingly, a handful of ingredients that made the equipment manager raise his eyebrows. Certain peppers and herbs he'd had to special order from Latin American suppliers, items most contestants had overlooked entirely. Back at her station, Maria began to work. No frantic energy. No performance for the cameras that occasionally swooped past. She moved with the kind of efficiency that comes not from culinary school, but from cooking the same dishes 1,000 times, from feeding people who depended on you, from kitchens where food meant survival and love, rather than art and ambition. Her knife work was flawless but understated. No flashy techniques, just perfect practice cuts executed with muscle memory so deep it bordered on meditation. She didn't measure anything, didn't check recipes, didn't second guess. Every motion was inevitable, like water flowing downhill. An hour passed. The competition hall filled with sounds and smells. Sizzling pans, boiling stocks, the sharp scent of seared meat, the sweet perfume of reduction sauces. Contestants shouted for equipment, cursed quietly at mistakes, tasted and adjusted with increasingly frantic energy. At the judges' table, Bellamy, Rousseau, and Yamamoto made notes, occasionally exchanging glances that could mean anything. The cameras loved the chaos, the passion, the drama. But one camera operator, a veteran of 20 years of culinary competitions, found his lens drifting again and again to the quiet woman at Station 7. She had built a fire. Not metaphorically, literally. In a small, contained area of her station, she'd constructed what the equipment manager had to approve as a controlled, traditional cooking method, essentially a small charcoal setup that mimicked open-flame cooking. While others used induction burners and precision temperature controls, Maria was cooking over actual fire, adjusting heat by raising and lowering a small pot, just as someone might have done in a village kitchen 50 years ago. The smell coming from her station began to change the atmosphere. It wasn't refined. It wasn't delicate. It was something more primal. Smoke and comfort, and the kind of hunger that comes from childhood memories rather than sophisticated palates. Chef Yamamoto's nose lifted slightly. He set down his pen and leaned forward, almost imperceptibly. Isabelle Rousseau's expression, typically fixed in professional neutrality, flickered with something that might have been curiosity. Even Bellamy, known for his stone-faced demeanor during competitions, tilted his head slightly toward Station 7, though he didn't turn to look. 2 hours in, a contestant at Station 12 had a breakdown. His emulsion had broken, his timing was off, and he stood frozen in the middle of his workspace, staring at the disaster on his plate. Cameras rushed over to capture the moment. Other contestants, sensing blood in the water, worked with renewed confidence. But Maria never looked up. She was somewhere else entirely, her hands working through motions that seemed less like cooking and more like ritual. She sang something under her breath, so quietly that even the boom microphones couldn't catch it. Just a whisper of melody in a language that might have been Spanish but carried influences from somewhere older, somewhere the cameras couldn't follow. With 30 minutes remaining, she began plating. Not on the expensive designer dishes provided by the competition, but on simple ceramic plates she'd apparently brought herself, the kind you might find in any family's kitchen. No architectural towers of food, no artistic smears of sauce, no microgreens or edible flowers. Just food arranged the way someone who loved you would serve dinner, generous, warm, inviting. She ladled a rich stew into one bowl, placed perfectly cooked rice alongside it, arranged fried plantains with the casual precision of practice. Steam rose in delicate wisps, carrying that smell that had been building for 2 hours. The scent that was starting to make even the production crew hungry, despite the craft services table loaded with catered food just outside the hall. The final buzzer sounded. Hands flew up from cooking surfaces. Burners clicked off. The sudden silence felt heavy after 3 hours of chaos. Contestants stepped back from their stations, some looking proud, others defeated, a few uncertain. Maria simply wiped down her workspace with a clean towel, methodical and calm, as if she'd just finished making dinner for her family and was doing the dishes before sitting down to eat. She didn't admire her work. Didn't nervously adjust the presentation. She just waited, hands folded, while the judges began their rounds. They started at Station 1, working methodically through each contestant. Bellamy's face remained impassive through elaborate presentations of deconstructed childhood memories and avant-garde interpretations of grandmother's recipes. Rousseau made notes, her expression revealing nothing. Yamamoto tasted with scientific precision, analyzing rather than enjoying. The cameras caught every reaction, every subtle nod or disappointed sigh. Contestants trembled as forks approached their plates. Some received polite nods. Others got questions that felt like interrogations. One received what might have been a small smile from Isabelle Rousseau, which caused a ripple of whispers among the watching contestants. Then the judges reached Station 7. Maria stood quietly. No nervous speech prepared, no explanation of her dish ready to spill forth. The three culinary titans looked down at the simple plates before them, at food that seemed almost defiant in its refusal to be impressive, that offered no apologies for its humble presentation. For a long moment, nobody moved. Bellamy glanced at Rousseau. Yamamoto's eyes fixed on Maria's face, searching for something. "Tell us about your dish," Bellamy said, his voice neutral. Maria looked at each of them in turn, and when she spoke, her voice carried an accent that had been smoothed by time, but never erased entirely. "This is what my mother made," she said simply. "When there wasn't much. When there was everything. When we celebrated. When we mourned. This is what home tastes like." Isabelle Rousseau lifted her fork first. The entire competition hall seemed to hold its breath. The fork pierced through the stew, gathering a perfect bite of chicken, beans, rice, and that complex sauce that had been building its flavors over the open flame. She brought it to her lips, closed her eyes, chewed slowly, and then something happened that the camera operator with 20 years of experience had never seen before. A single tear rolled down Isabelle Rousseau's cheek, not from sadness or frustration, but from something else entirely, something that made her set down her fork and press her napkin to her eyes for just a moment before composing herself. Chef Bellamy was already tasting, and his perpetual frown had vanished, replaced by an expression of such profound concentration that he might have been solving a complex equation. Yamamoto, the scientist who approached food as chemistry and physics, ate his portion in complete silence, then did something unprecedented. He reached for his fork and took a second bite before moving to the next station. The judges exchanged a look that the contestants couldn't decipher, a wordless conversation that seemed to contain questions none of them wanted to ask out loud. Maria stood perfectly still, watching them with those dark, knowing eyes that seemed to see far more than they should. And in that moment, as cameras captured the judges' unusual reactions, and producers in the control room sat forward in their chairs, and contestants whispered confused speculation to each other, one truth became achingly clear. Something was happening at Station 7 that transcended cooking, transcended competition, transcended everything they thought they understood about food and the woman who had made it. Maria's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more complex. Not sadness exactly, but a deep understanding of impermanence. It closed 10 years ago. The neighborhood changed. Rents went up. People wanted different things. Fast food, trendy places with small portions and big prices. She carefully tucked the photograph back into her bag. But what she taught me, that doesn't close. That stays. Before the assistant could respond, a commotion erupted at the other end of the waiting room. Someone had recognized someone. The blonde contestant with the gold leaf was pointing at her phone, then at Maria, her voice rising with each word. "Oh my God, oh my God, do you people not know who that is?" Other contestants crowded around, looking at whatever was on the phone screen, then turning to stare at Maria with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to something like betrayal. Maria didn't move. She'd known this moment would come eventually. It always did. The blonde marched across the room, phone extended like a weapon, stopping just short of Maria's corner. "You're her," she said, her voice quaking with emotion that might have been awe or anger or both. "You're Maria Elena Santos, the Maria Elena Santos. You have 4 restaurants, 4. 2 of them have Michelin stars. You've cooked for presidents. You won the International Chef of the Year award 3 times. You've been called one of the most influential culinary voices of our generation. Her voice cracked. Why are you here? Why are you competing with us? This competition is supposed to be for emerging talent, for people trying to build careers, not for someone like me. Maria finished quietly. She stood slowly, facing the growing crowd of contestants. The room had gone completely silent except for the muted sounds from the television monitors. Even the production crew had stopped moving, sensing drama unfolding. You're right. I have restaurants. I have recognition. I have things that many of you are working toward. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But I entered this competition under the open division, which has no restrictions on experience. I followed every rule. I used the same ingredients available to everyone. I received no special treatment. But why? Another contestant demanded, a young man whose hands were still stained with turmeric from his dish. What could you possibly need to prove? Maria looked at each of them in turn, her dark eyes moving from face to face, seeing their anger and confusion and fear. I'm not here to prove anything, she said softly. I'm here to remember something, or maybe to find out if I've forgotten it. She gestured vaguely toward the competition hall. When my mother died, she left me her recipes, not written down. She never wrote anything down. She left them here. Maria touched her temple, and here. She touched her heart. I took those recipes and I made them sophisticated. I elevated them. I deconstructed and reconstructed them. I added techniques from France and Japan and everywhere I trained. I made them impressive enough for Michelin inspectors and food critics and wealthy diners who paid $200 for a tasting menu. She fell silent for a moment, and in that silence, something raw and honest filled the room. But somewhere in all that elevation, I started to wonder if I'd lost something. If in trying to prove that street food could be fine dining, that a poor girl from a neighborhood nobody cared about could cook for presidents, I'd forgotten why my mother's food made people cry. Not from sophistication, not from technique, but from recognition, from being seen, from tasting home. Maria's voice dropped to barely a whisper. So I came here to cook like she cooked. Simply, honestly, without any of the reputation or the restaurants or the awards protecting me, just to see if the food still means anything without all the decoration around it. The blonde contestant lowered her phone slowly. Her anger had transformed into something else, not quite sympathy, but a kind of understanding that crossed the vast distance between them. That's what the judges tasted, she said, more to herself than to Maria. That's why Isabelle Rousseau cried. Before Maria could respond, a production coordinator appeared in the doorway. They're ready for you, she announced. Final judging in 10 minutes. Please return to the competition hall. The contestants filed back into the massive space, which had been transformed during their absence. The individual cooking stations had been cleared away, replaced by a single long table where the judges sat, solemn as a tribunal. The lighting had changed too, softer now, more intimate, as if this final portion of the competition belonged to a different genre of story altogether. All 24 contestants lined up facing the judges, but the cameras seemed to focus disproportionately on Station 7's humble representative, the woman who had been nobody and turned out to be somebody, and was now standing there trying to figure out which identity was actually true. Chef Marcus Bellamy stood, his considerable height lending gravity to the moment. This was one of the most challenging deliberations in the history of this competition, he began, his accent crisp and formal. Not because the dishes were all excellent, though many were very good, but because the task we set revealed something we don't often see in culinary competitions. We asked for home. Most of you gave us performances of home, interpretations, concepts. Very few gave us the actual thing. Isabelle Rousseau stood next, her earlier tears completely erased, her professional mask firmly back in place. Food at its highest level is not about complexity, she said, her French accent softening the hard truths she was delivering. It is about honesty, about courage, about being willing to serve who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. Some of you showed us impressive technique today, beautiful presentations, sophisticated flavor combinations, but very few showed us your souls. Kenji Yamamoto rose last, his movements precise and economical. In molecular gastronomy, we learn to break food down to its essential components, to understand it scientifically. But there is another kind of breaking down, a different kind of essential. It is the reduction of food to its emotional core, to the reason humans have gathered around fires and tables for thousands of years. Not to be impressed, not to be challenged, but to be nourished, to be comforted, to be reminded that we belong to something larger than ourselves. The three judges exchanged glances, and then Bellamy spoke again. We have selected our top 5 finalists who will advance to tomorrow's final challenge. However, before we announce those names, we need to address something unusual. His eyes moved deliberately to Maria, and every camera in the room followed his gaze. One contestant today cooked under what some might consider false pretenses. Not breaking any rules, we've verified that carefully, but certainly not revealing the full truth of their background and experience. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Contestants shifted uncomfortably. Maria stood perfectly still, her face revealing nothing, waiting for judgment she had known would come. This was why she had hesitated to enter the competition, why she had used only her legal name without professional credentials, why she had dressed simply and carried her mother's old bag instead of the custom equipment her restaurants provided. She had wanted to cook without the weight of expectation. But expectations, she was learning, followed you like shadows even when you tried to step into light. Maria Santos, Bellamy continued, and the formality of his tone suggested this could go either way. You are one of the most acclaimed chefs of our generation. Your restaurants are destinations. Your techniques have influenced countless others. You didn't need to be here. He paused, and in that pause, the entire trajectory of Maria's career seemed to hang suspended, ready to tip toward validation or collapse into scandal. But what you did need, what we all need sometimes, is to remember why we started cooking in the first place. Before the fame, before the pressure, before food became about impressing anyone. Your dish today was not the most technically impressive. It was not innovative. It was not trying to be anything other than what it was. Isabelle Rousseau stepped forward, and her voice, when she spoke, carried an emotion she rarely revealed. It was true, she said simply. And in a world where so much food is performance, truth is the rarest ingredient. When I tasted what you made, I was transported to my grandmother's kitchen in Lyon. Not because the food was the same. It wasn't. But because it came from the same place. The place where feeding people is an act of love rather than ambition. Maria's composure finally cracked, just slightly, a tremor in her jaw, a brightness in her eyes that might have been tears held back by sheer will. She had spent 15 years building an empire, proving that she belonged in rooms where people like her weren't supposed to exist, fighting for recognition and respect and stars on prestigious guides. And here, in this moment, 3 of the most powerful people in her industry were telling her that the most important thing she'd done all day was remember how her mother cooked beans. Yamamoto spoke last, his voice quiet, but carrying clearly through the massive space. Tomorrow's final challenge will test your skills in ways you cannot anticipate. But tonight, I want to say something to all of you. He looked down the line of contestants, making eye contact with each one. This industry will tell you that success means complexity, innovation, pushing boundaries, and those things have value. But never forget that the most powerful food is often the simplest. The food that connects us to who we were before we learned to be impressive. Ms. Santos reminded us of that today, and for that, regardless of competition results, we are grateful. The formal announcement of finalists came next, names called in alphabetical order. The blonde with the gold leaf made the top 5. Her technique, despite her choices, had been flawless. The man with the foie gras did not, sent home with respectful compliments that couldn't hide his devastation. A young woman who had made her Puerto Rican grandmother's pastels advanced, tears streaming down her face. A chef who had cooked his Senegalese father's yassa moved forward, his hands shaking with relief. And when Bellamy called Maria Santos, there was no surprise, only an inevitable sense that this story had been heading toward this moment from the beginning, that some outcomes are written in ingredients and fire, and the memories of women who cook in tiny kitchens for people they love. As the dismissed contestants filed out, and the finalists remained behind for briefing on the next day's challenge, Maria found herself standing alone for a moment near the windows where golden light still filtered through. She pulled out the photograph of her mother once more, staring at that tiny restaurant that no longer existed. At that smile that held more wisdom than any culinary school could teach. And she understood, finally, what she'd been searching for by entering this competition. Not validation, not victory, but permission. Permission to be both the acclaimed chef with Michelin stars and the daughter who still cooked her mother's beans exactly the way she'd been taught. Permission to be sophisticated and simple, elevated and humble, somebody and nobody all at once. The photograph blurred as tears finally came, quiet and unstoppable, washing away 15 years of armor she'd built to protect herself from the world's judgment. And when she looked up again, she saw her own reflection in the window glass, superimposed over the photograph in her hands, her mother's smile merging with her own face, past and present becoming one image, one truth. One woman who finally understood that she'd never had to choose between where she came from and where she was going because they were always the same journey, just viewed from different windows of the same light-filled room. The briefing for the final challenge took place in a smaller conference room adjacent to the competition hall, intimate and windowless, lit by overhead lights that hummed with an almost accusatory frequency. The 5 finalists sat around a polished table that reflected their faces back at them like uncertain ghosts. Maria noticed how the young woman who'd made pastels kept clasping and unclasping her hands, how the Senegalese chef rhythmically tapped his foot against the table leg, how the blonde sat with perfect posture but couldn't stop her eyes from darting toward Maria every few seconds, as if trying to reconcile the humble woman from Station 7 with the legendary chef she'd discovered on her phone. Chef Bellamy entered carrying a single sealed envelope, followed by Rousseau and Yamamoto. The 3 judges didn't sit, but instead stood at the head of the table like professors about to deliver news that would change lives. The camera crew had been dismissed. This moment, apparently, belonged only to the people in this room, free from the performance required by lenses and audiences. Tomorrow's challenge is unlike anything we've done before, Bellamy began, his voice stripped of the formality he'd used in the main hall. Here, in this small room with just 5 people, he seemed almost human, almost vulnerable. We've spent 20 years running this competition, and every year we've asked contestants to demonstrate skill, creativity, innovation. We've crowned champions who could do extraordinary things with ingredients, who could plate food like artists, who could command kitchens like generals directing armies. He paused, and something in his expression suggested regret, or perhaps reconsideration of a life's work. But what we've realized, especially after today, is that we've been asking the wrong question. Isabelle Rousseau stepped forward, her perpetually elegant posture softening slightly. "We have been judging food as if it exists in a vacuum," she said, her accent making even difficult truths sound like poetry. "As if the dish on the plate is separate from the hands that made it, the story behind it, the intention within it. But today, when I tasted Ms. Santos's stew, I did not just taste beans and chicken and rice. I tasted a mother's love. I tasted survival and celebration. I tasted the kind of nourishment that feeds more than bodies. She looked directly at Maria, her eyes holding something that might have been apology. And it made me realize that for 30 years as a food critic, I have perhaps been looking at the wrong things, judging the wrong elements. Yamamoto picked up the thread, his scientific precision now applied to matters of the soul. In my work with molecular gastronomy, I break food into molecules, into chemical reactions, into measurable phenomena. Temperature, texture, flavor compounds, all quantifiable. But what happened today cannot be measured in a laboratory. What you created, Mrs. Santos, and what some of you others touched upon, exists in a dimension that science cannot reach. The dimension of memory, of meaning, of food as communion rather than consumption. The finalists exchanged confused glances. The blonde finally voiced what they were all thinking. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is tomorrow's challenge?" Bellamy opened the envelope slowly, deliberately, as if the paper inside might change everything. "Tomorrow, you will not cook in the competition hall," he said. "You will not have access to premium ingredients or professional equipment. Instead, each of you will be given an address, a place in this city where people gather to eat. A soup kitchen, a community center, a shelter, a nursing home, a children's hospital." He pulled out 5 cards from the envelope, each bearing a handwritten address. "You will be given a modest budget, enough for simple ingredients, nothing extravagant. You will cook a meal for the people at your assigned location, not to impress them, not to educate them, simply to feed them, to nourish them." The silence that followed was profound. The pastel chef looked like she might cry again. The Senegalese chef sat back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face as if he'd just been given an answer to a question he'd been asking his entire career. The blonde's perfect posture collapsed slightly, and for the first time all day, she looked genuinely uncertain, stripped of the confidence that expensive ingredients and technical prowess had always provided her. "But how will you judge?" the blonde asked, and the question revealed more than she probably intended. How will you measure? How will you rank? How will you determine worth in something that can't be photographed for Instagram or described in a prestigious review? Russo smiled, and it was the saddest smile Maria had ever seen, heavy with years of realizing too late what mattered. "We won't judge the food," she said quietly, "not in any traditional sense. We will visit each location. We will observe. We will watch how people respond to what you make, how they eat, how they gather, whether the food creates community or merely fills stomachs. And then we will decide not which dish was most impressive, but which chef understood the assignment we should have been giving all along, that cooking is not ultimately about the cook. It's about the people being fed." Maria felt something crack open inside her chest, a sensation like ice breaking in spring, painful and necessary and inevitable. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Permission not just to cook like her mother, but to cook for the reasons her mother had cooked. Not for acclaim or recognition or stars in prestigious guides, but for the taxi driver who needed lunch, for the construction worker whose hands hurt, for the student far from home, for the elderly woman who ate alone, for anyone who needed to be reminded that someone cared whether they were nourished or not. "You'll be assigned your locations tonight," Bellamy continued. "You'll have tomorrow morning to shop and prepare. Service will be at dinner time, 6 o'clock. We'll be watching, but from a distance. No cameras in your face, no performance pressure. Just you, your food, and the people you're feeding." He began distributing the cards, sliding them across the table one by one. "This is not about winning anymore. This is about remembering why any of us ever entered a kitchen in the first place." Maria's card was last. She turned it over and read the address, and something in her chest tightened further. St. Catherine's Community Center. She knew that place. It was 6 blocks from where her mother's restaurant had stood, in the neighborhood that had changed and pushed people like them out, where wealthy newcomers now paid $15 for artisanal coffee in spaces that used to house struggling families. But St. Catherine's remained, somehow. A holdout, a refuge, a place where the original residents still gathered, still tried to maintain community in a landscape that no longer recognized them. "You know it," Yamamoto observed, watching her face carefully. Maria nodded slowly. "My mother used to bring food there," she said, her voice distant, traveling across years. "On Thursdays, after her restaurant closed for the afternoon, she'd pack up whatever was left and take it to St. Catherine's. She said the people there were her people, the ones who'd been forgotten by the neighborhood's new story." Maria's fingers traced the edges of the card. "I haven't been back there since her funeral. Couldn't bear to see how much had changed." "And now you must return," Rousseau said softly. It wasn't a question. The finalists were dismissed shortly after, sent back to their hotels with instructions to rest, to plan, to prepare for a challenge that was somehow both simpler and more terrifying than anything they'd anticipated. As they filed out of the conference room, the blonde paused beside Maria. Her earlier hostility completely evaporated. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For earlier, for not understanding. I've spent 5 years trying to make food that would get me noticed. I've never thought about making food that would actually matter." Maria touched her arm gently. "There's no shame in wanting recognition," she said. "I've spent 15 years chasing it. But maybe we both needed to be reminded that the recognition isn't the point. It's just a side effect of doing the real work." The blonde nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and then she was gone, leaving Maria alone in the hallway outside the conference room. The building had emptied, production crew departed, equipment shut down, the massive competition hall dark and silent. Maria wandered back into that space, her footsteps echoing against the high ceiling, and stood at what had been Station 7. Someone had left her simple ceramic plates stacked neatly, and beside them, her mother's old canvas bag that Maria had thought she'd taken with her. She sat down on the floor beside the station, suddenly exhausted beyond measure, and pulled the bag into her lap. Inside, beneath the photograph of her mother, were other items she'd brought but hadn't needed for the competition. Her mother's recipes, finally written down after her death. Dozens of them, transcribed from memory, from the smell of things, from the way steam rose from pots, from the particular sound of onions sizzling in oil at exactly the right temperature. Maria had recorded them all, terrified they'd be lost otherwise, terrified that without documentation, her mother's life's work would vanish as completely as that little restaurant with the corrugated metal roof. But looking at them now, in the dim emergency lighting of the empty competition hall, Maria understood that her mother's recipes had never needed to be written down. They existed not in measurements and instructions, but in the knowledge of how to feed people who needed feeding. In the instinct for what would comfort and nourish. In the understanding that food was love made visible and edible and shareable. You couldn't write that down any more than you could write down how to care about someone, how to notice when they were hungry for more than just calories, how to create safety and belonging through the simple act of cooking with intention. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from her sous chef at her flagship restaurant. "How did it go?" Followed by several anxious emojis. Maria stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "I'm not sure yet. Ask me tomorrow." She almost added more, some explanation of what had happened, what she'd learned, how the entire foundation of her career suddenly felt both validated and questioned simultaneously. But words felt insufficient. Instead, she slipped the phone away and sat in the darkness, letting the silence of the empty hall settle over her like a blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a door closed. Security making rounds probably, or a janitor beginning the night shift. The sound echoed and faded, and in that fading, Maria heard her mother's voice. Not as memory exactly, but as something deeper, more fundamental. Her mother had never said much while cooking. She'd worked in a kind of meditative silence, speaking only to call out orders when the lunch rush hit or to greet customers by name. But sometimes, late at night after closing, when young Maria would help wash dishes, her mother would talk. About her own mother, who'd cooked in an even smaller kitchen in a village that no longer existed. About food as resistance, as survival, as the thing that couldn't be taken away even when everything else was. About how feeding people was the most revolutionary act possible, because it insisted they deserved to be nourished, to be cared for, to matter. "You will do something bigger than this," her mother had told her once, gesturing at the tiny restaurant with pride and pragmatism, in equal measure. "You have the talent, you have the hunger, not for food, for something more. You'll go further than I ever could." At the time, young Maria had heard this as prophecy, as permission to leave, to pursue culinary school and prestigious kitchens and the sophisticated world her mother would never access. But now, sitting in the empty competition hall with her mother's recipes in her lap and an address card in her pocket that would take her back to the neighborhood she'd left behind, Maria wondered if she'd misunderstood. Maybe her mother hadn't meant further in distance or status, but deeper, further into the truth of what cooking actually meant when you stripped away everything else. She stood up slowly, her body stiff from sitting on the hard floor, and gathered her things. The ceramic plates, the canvas bag. Her mother's presence, which felt somehow more tangible here in this empty space than it had in years. As she walked toward the exit, Maria made a decision that would have terrified her 24 hours earlier, but now felt like the only possible choice. Tomorrow, at St. Catherine's Community Center, she wouldn't cook like Maria Elena Santos, celebrated chef with Michelin stars and international acclaim. She would cook like her mother had cooked, simply, generously, with the kind of love that asked nothing in return except that people be fed. Not impressed, not challenged, not educated, just fed, just seen, just reminded that someone cared whether they had dinner or not. The night air hit her face as she pushed through the building's front doors, cool and carrying the smell of the city, exhaust and restaurant grease and humanity packed close together. Maria stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, looking up at stars barely visible through light pollution, and felt the weight of tomorrow settling over her like a cloak. She would return to the neighborhood that no longer knew her, to the community center where her mother had brought food every Thursday, to the people who'd been left behind by progress and prosperity, and all the pretty words that meant some humans mattered more than others. And she would cook, not to win, not to prove anything, but to honor a woman who'd understood that feeding people was sacred work, even when, especially when, nobody was watching, nobody was judging, nobody would ever write a review or award a star or take a photograph for social media. This was the challenge that mattered. Not tomorrow's official competition, but the private one Maria had been failing for 15 years. The challenge of staying true to the reasons she'd learned to cook in the first place, before ambition and recognition had rewritten her story into something more impressive and less honest. She pulled out her phone and opened a note, typing quickly before courage could fade. Menu for St. Catherine's. The things Mama made when there wasn't much. When there was everything. When we celebrated. When we mourned. The things that taste like home. Then she added one more line, her fingers trembling slightly as she wrote it. The things I forgot, I knew how to make. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Maria woke at 4:30, as she had every day for 20 years, her body trained by decades of restaurant hours to rise while most of the world still slept. But this morning felt different. The darkness outside her hotel window seemed heavier, more expectant, as if the city itself was holding its breath. She didn't turn on the lights immediately. Instead, She sat on the edge of the bed, letting her eyes adjust to the pre-dawn dimness, and thought about the last time she'd shopped for food the way her mother used to shop. Not from specialty purveyors and farmers markets where vendors knew her name and saved their best for her restaurants, but from the kind of grocery stores where prices mattered, where luxury was a word that didn't exist, where food was fuel and comfort and community rather than art. By 5:30 she was dressed and out the door, driving through empty streets toward a neighborhood she'd actively avoided for a decade. The city transformed as she moved away from the gleaming downtown corridors. Buildings grew shorter, older, more worn. Gentrification's tide had reached this far, but hadn't fully washed over it yet, leaving a strange mixed landscape where organic juice bars shared blocks with bodegas that had been there for 40 years, where renovated lofts loomed over family-owned restaurants with hand-painted signs in Spanish and Korean, and languages that had no written form, only memory. She parked outside Mercado Elena, no relation despite the name, a grocery store that had somehow survived every economic shift and trend cycle. The security gate was just being raised by an elderly man who moved with the careful slowness of someone whose joints hurt, but who would never admit it. He glanced at Maria as she approached, and something in his eyes suggested recognition, though not of her current self. He was seeing through her expensive but understated clothes, through the confidence that success brings, to the girl who used to come here with her mother, helping carry bags, learning which vegetables were fresh and which were just pretending. "You're Eleanor's daughter," he said. Not a question, a statement of fact that arrived like an accusation or a blessing, impossible to tell which. Maria stopped, her hand on the door. "Yes," she said simply, and the word felt like stepping through a portal into a past she'd been running from without realizing she was running. "She was good people," the man said, already turning away, not interested in her response, not needing her to explain where she'd been or why it took 10 years to come back. The good ones always leave. Inside, the store smelled exactly as she remembered: cilantro and ripe plantains, dried chiles and corn masa, the particular scent of a place where food still meant survival for most customers, rather than entertainment. The aisles were narrow, the lighting fluorescent and unforgiving, the floor tiles cracked and patched with mismatched replacements. Nothing like the pristine suppliers she used for her restaurants, where ingredients came with pedigrees and certificates of authenticity. Here, food was honest in its ordinariness, beautiful in its refusal to be anything other than what it was. Maria moved through the aisles slowly, her hands selecting items from muscle memory, the right tomatoes, not the perfect ones, the ones that would break down properly in a stew, onions that had weight and promise, garlic that felt alive in her palm. She filled her cart with simple things, inexpensive things, the building blocks of meals that her mother had made thousands of times in that little restaurant with the corrugated roof. Other early morning shoppers moved around her, a woman in scrubs coming off a night shift, an older man buying ingredients for his wife's breakfast, a young mother with a sleeping baby strapped to her chest, calculating prices in her head with the careful mathematics of someone for whom $10 was the difference between abundance and scarcity. At the checkout, Maria's cart cost $63. She thought about the single dish at her flagship restaurant that cost more than that, seared scallops with saffron foam and microgreens that customers photographed before eating. She thought about how many people she could feed with $63 if feeding them was actually the point. The cashier, a teenager with elaborate nail art and tired eyes, rang up each item without interest, but when she glanced at Maria's face, something shifted. "You look like someone," she said, squinting slightly. "Can't remember who. Someone my abuela used to talk about." Maria smiled but didn't explain. She paid in cash, gathered her bags, and walked out into a morning that was finally beginning to lighten. the sun not yet visible but its promise coloring the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold that looked nothing like the filtered photographs people posted online, but everything like actual dawn, unedited and true. St. Catherine's Community Centre was exactly where she remembered, though shrunken somehow, as if memory had enlarged it or present circumstances had compressed it. The building was single-story, beige stucco, marked by water stains and the ghosts of old graffiti painted over but never quite erased. The parking lot had more potholes than pavement. Someone had attempted to create a garden in front, but only the hardiest plants had survived, succulents and tough native grasses that thrived on neglect. A hand-painted sign by the door announced Thursday community dinner, 6 p.m., all welcome, in English and Spanish, the letters fading but still legible, maintained by hands that cared even when funding didn't. Maria sat in her car for a long moment, staring at the building, and felt 15 years of careful construction begin to crack. She'd built herself into someone new, sophisticated, successful, worthy of attention and acclaim. But looking at St. Catherine's, she understood that she'd also built herself away from something essential, from the knowledge that success measured in stars and reviews was one kind of achievement. But success measured in fed people was something else entirely, something her mother had understood without ever needing to articulate it. She gathered her grocery bags and walked to the entrance. The door was unlocked, swinging open into a multi-purpose room that tried desperately to be everything: community center, emergency shelter, after-school program, senior gathering place. Folding tables leaned against walls painted a cheerful yellow that couldn't quite hide the cracks underneath. A small stage at one end suggested performances that probably never happened. Bulletin boards overflowed with notices, rent assistance, ESL classes, immigration support, job listings, missing person flyers, announcements for celebrations and memorials, the entire spectrum of human need and hope documented in paper and pushpins. The kitchen was through a door at the back, and when Maria pushed through, she was transported completely. The space was tiny, smaller even than her mother's restaurant kitchen, with equipment that was ancient, scarred by decades of use but maintained with obvious care. A 6-burner stove with 2 burners that looked questionable, a commercial refrigerator that hummed ominously, counters that were clean but worn down to the underlying wood in places where thousands of meals had been prepared. This was where her mother had come every Thursday. This was where she'd transformed leftovers and simple ingredients into meals that fed 30 or 40 people. This was where she'd practiced the kind of cooking that no Michelin inspector would ever witness. But that meant infinitely more than anything that happened in pristine professional kitchens designed to impress rather than nourish. "You're early." The voice came from the doorway, and Maria turned to see a woman in her 50s, heavy-set and wearing a St. Catherine's staff shirt that had seen better days. Her face was kind but exhausted, carrying the particular weariness of someone who cared deeply about things that the world had decided didn't matter. They said someone from that cooking competition would be here today. Didn't expect a famous chef. The woman's tone wasn't impressed or deferential, just factual, maybe slightly skeptical, as if fame was a credential that meant nothing in this kitchen where the only thing that mattered was whether people left fed. "I'm Maria," she said, not bothering with her full name or her titles, "Elena's daughter." The woman's expression transformed completely, suspicion melting into something that looked like recognition and grief mixed together. "Dios mío," she whispered. "Elena's daughter. She talked about you, showed us pictures. So proud, even though—" She stopped herself, but Maria could fill in the rest. "Even though you left, even though you forgot where you came from, even though you got too important to visit. Even though I stayed away," Maria finished for her. "I know, I'm sorry." The woman shook her head. "Your mama understood. She wanted bigger things for you. But she also said—" Another pause, more careful. She said she worried you'd forget the difference between cooking to impress and cooking to feed. Said those are two different religions, and most chefs only practice one. Maria set down her grocery bags, her hands trembling slightly. "What's your name?" she asked. "Carmen. I've been running this place for 12 years. Knew your mama the whole time. She kept us going more weeks than I can count." Carmen moved into the kitchen, her hands automatically straightening things that were already straight, the nervous energy of someone who'd learned to stay busy to avoid feeling too much. Thursday dinners used to be her thing. After she passed, we've had volunteers, but it's not the same. People come because they're hungry, and we feed them. But what your mama did, she made people feel like they mattered. Like the food was a gift, not charity. There's a difference. "I know," Maria said quietly, unpacking her groceries, arranging ingredients on the scarred counter. "She taught me that. I just forgot for a while, got distracted by other things." Carmen watched her work, her skepticism slowly transforming into something else. "So this competition, they're judging you on feeding our people. That's what this is." "Yes, but also no." Maria paused, trying to find words for something she barely understood herself. "They're judging whether I remember why cooking matters. Whether I can make food that feeds more than just stomachs. Whether I can—" She trailed off, overwhelmed suddenly by the magnitude of what she was attempting. To somehow compress 15 years of evolution and education and elevation back down into the simple truth her mother had lived. To cook not as Maria Elena Santos, the celebrated chef, but as Elena's daughter, the girl who'd learned that feeding people was love made edible. "Your mama used to say something," Carmen offered, moving to help unpack ingredients, her hands sure and practiced. "She said when you cook for people who have nothing, you better bring everything. Not fancy ingredients, everything inside yourself, all your care, all your attention, all your respect. Because people who've been treated like they don't matter can taste it when someone actually gives a damn." Maria stopped, a bag of dried beans in her hands, and felt tears beginning that she couldn't stop. She said that every Thursday, like a prayer before she started cooking. Carmen's voice was gentle now, understanding. "So what are you making today?" "Everything she taught me," Maria said simply, and began to work. The hours that followed were unlike any Maria had experienced in 15 years of professional cooking. There were no sous chefs to prep her mise en place, no line cooks to execute her vision, no expediter to manage timing. Just her hands and Carmen's occasional help and ingredients that required coaxing rather than transformation. She built her stew the way her mother had built it, slowly, patiently, letting flavors develop through time rather than technique. She prepared rice not in a professional rice cooker, but in a scarred pot on an unreliable burner, adjusting heat by instinct and attention. She made plantains in oil that wasn't precisely temperature controlled, flipping them when they looked right rather than when a thermometer said so. Other volunteers arrived as afternoon approached. An elderly man named Roberto, who'd been coming to St. Catherine's since it opened. A young couple who'd met at Thursday dinners and now came back to help serve. A teenager doing community service hours who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else until Carmen put him to work chopping vegetables and he discovered a rhythm he hadn't known he was capable of finding. They moved around Maria's cooking with careful respect, not because she was famous, but because her presence had transformed the kitchen into something that felt sacred, purposeful, alive with intention. By 5 o'clock, the food was ready. Huge pots of stew simmering on every available burner, rice steaming in fragrant clouds, plantains piled golden and perfect on mismatched serving platters. The smells filling St. Catherine's were not sophisticated or innovative or Instagram-worthy. They were primal, honest, the kind of smells that reached into your chest and reminded you what hunger actually meant and how satisfying food could be when it came from hands that cared whether you ate or not. At 5:30, Carmen unlocked the front doors and people began to arrive. Not the kind of people who lined up for reservations at Maria's restaurants, willing to wait months for a table and pay premium prices for the privilege. These were people for whom Thursday dinner at St. Catherine's might be the only proper meal they'd eat all week. Elderly residents whose social security checks ran out by the third week of each month. Day laborers paid in cash with nothing left over, families living in cars, veterans navigating broken systems, immigrants navigating even more broken ones, children whose school lunch programs didn't operate after hours or on weekends. Everyone who'd been rendered invisible by an economy that celebrated wealth and ignored need. They filled the multi-purpose room, claiming folding chairs at folding tables, greeting each other with the familiarity of regulars, talking in multiple languages, creating a community held together by the simple fact of shared hunger and shared humanity. Maria watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart pounding harder than it had at any moment during the actual competition, and understood what her mother had known. That this was the real cooking. This was the test that mattered. This was where you discovered whether food could actually do what you claimed it could do when you talked about nourishment and comfort and belonging. Carmen touched her shoulder gently. "Ready?" Maria nodded, though she'd never felt less ready for anything in her life. "Let's feed them." They brought out the food, Carmen and Roberto and the young couple and the teenage volunteer and Maria, carrying pots and platters and serving spoons, and began to fill plates. Maria stood at the serving line, ladling stew into bowls, adding rice, placing plantains with care, and made eye contact with every single person who came through. Not the professional smile she gave restaurant patrons, not the performance of graciousness, just actual seeing, acknowledging that they were here, that they mattered, that this food was made for them specifically, and with intention, and with respect. An elderly woman came through the line, moving slowly with a walker, and when she looked at the stew, her eyes filled with tears. "This smells like my mama's cooking," she said in Spanish, her voice breaking. "I haven't smelled this in 30 years. A construction worker, still dusty from his job site, stared at his plate with something that looked like disbelief. "You made this? Really made this? Not just reheated something?" A young mother with 2 small children accepted her plates with a gratitude that was almost painful to witness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Maria served until everyone had been through the line once, then continued as people came back for seconds, and the room filled with sounds that no Michelin inspector had ever evaluated. The sounds of people eating food that actually fed them, not just in their stomachs, but in places deeper and more desperate. Conversation, laughter, the particular satisfaction of hunger meeting nourishment, children telling stories, elderly residents sharing memories, strangers becoming less strange over shared plates. And somewhere in the middle of this, as Maria refilled a bowl for a man who'd eaten his first helping in about 90 seconds, she looked up and saw them. The 3 judges, Bellamy, Rousseau, and Yamamoto, standing quietly in the back of the room, not announcing themselves, not demanding attention, just watching. They'd been there for a while, she realized, long enough to see not just the food, but how people responded to it, how the room had transformed from a collection of isolated individuals into something that resembled family. How food had created community in the way her mother had always insisted it could, when you remembered that feeding people was ministry, not industry. Their expressions were unreadable from this distance, but Maria realized with sudden certainty that whatever they thought, whatever they decided, it didn't matter anymore. This was the victory, this room full of fed people, this moment of connection and care, this practice of cooking as love rather than achievement. Everything else was just conversation. The 3 judges remained in the back of the room for another 20 minutes, not eating, not speaking, just observing the way anthropologists might study a culture they'd forgotten existed. Maria continued serving, but she felt their presence like pressure in the air before a storm. Not threatening exactly, but significant, charged with the weight of judgment that couldn't be avoided, no matter how much she told herself it didn't matter anymore. Around her, the community continued its meal, unaware that their dinner was being evaluated, that their responses to food were data points in a competition they'd never signed up for. Or perhaps they knew and didn't care, too focused on the immediate reality of warm food and full plates to worry about the abstract concerns of chefs and critics and people who lived in worlds where food was abundant enough to be performance rather than necessity. Carmen appeared at Maria's elbow, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Those people in the back," she said quietly, nodding toward the judges. "They with you?" "Yes," Maria admitted. "They're here to watch, to evaluate." Carmen's expression hardened slightly. "Evaluate what? Whether our people are grateful enough? Whether poverty looks authentic enough for their reality show?" The edge in her voice was sharp, protective, the tone of someone who'd spent years defending her community from people who wanted to study them, photograph them, use them as props in narratives about social responsibility before returning to lives where poverty was theoretical rather than daily. "No," Maria said quickly. "They're evaluating me. Whether I remember how to cook for people rather than for cameras, whether I—" She paused, searching for honesty. "Whether I'm still my mother's daughter or if I've become something else entirely." Carmen studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Elena would be proud," she said simply. "Not of the fancy restaurants or the awards. Of this. Of you being here. Of you remembering." She squeezed Maria's shoulder and moved back to the serving line, where the flow of people was finally slowing. Bellies full, the urgent edge of hunger satisfied at least for tonight. By 7 o'clock, the meal was winding down. People lingered over their plates, reluctant to leave the warmth and community for whatever waited outside. Shelters, cars, apartments where electricity had been shut off, the streets themselves. The teenage volunteer who'd started the evening looking surly was now playing cards with a group of elderly residents, laughing at their jokes, completely transformed by the simple act of being useful. The young couple who'd met at Thursday dinners stood in the corner having an animated discussion about how to replicate the stew at home, scribbling notes on a paper napkin like it was a sacred text. The construction worker had fallen asleep in his chair, exhausted from his shift, but looking more peaceful than he probably had in weeks. Maria began cleaning up, scraping plates and stacking dishes, falling into the rhythm of kitchen work that required no thought, just motion. Her back ached, her feet hurt, her hands smelled like garlic and onions and smoke. She felt more tired than she had after any service in her Michelin-starred restaurants, where teams of staff handled the cleanup while she consulted with managers and reviewed reservation systems and maintained the architecture of success. But this exhaustion felt different, earned rather than accumulated, satisfying rather than depleting, the good tired that comes from physical work done for clear purpose. She was elbow deep in dishwater. The industrial dishwasher had broken 2 months ago, and St. Catherine's couldn't afford repairs. When she sensed someone standing behind her, she turned to find Isabelle Rousseau, the legendary food critic who could destroy careers with a single review, holding a drying towel as if she'd done this before, as if she remembered what it meant to work in kitchens where glamour didn't exist and dishes didn't wash themselves. "May I help?" Rousseau asked. And there was something in her voice that suggested this was not about the competition, not about evaluation, but about something more fundamental. One cook recognizing another, one woman acknowledging the work that other women had been doing in kitchens forever, the unglamorous labor that made all the celebrated meals possible. Maria handed her a clean plate wordlessly, and they worked together in silence for several minutes, the rhythm of wash and dry as old as cooking itself. Finally, Rousseau spoke. "When I tasted your food today," she said, keeping her eyes on the plate she was drying, "I was not here. I was 8 years old in my grandmother's kitchen in Lyon. She was making pot-au-feu, and I was sitting on a stool watching her, and she was teaching me that cooking is not about impressing anyone. It is about taking care of people, about noticing who is hungry, not just for food, but for attention, for recognition, for the feeling of being worth someone's effort. She set down the dried plate and picked up another. I forgot that somewhere. I spent 30 years telling chefs their food was not good enough, not innovative enough, not worthy of praise. I made careers and destroyed them. I became powerful. She paused, and when she continued, her voice was so quiet, Maria had to lean closer to hear. But I have never, not once in 30 years, seen people eat with the joy and gratitude that I witnessed tonight. And I realized that for all my power, for all my influence, I have perhaps been measuring the wrong things, judging by the wrong standards, missing the entire point. Maria stopped washing, her hands still in the soapy water, and looked at the woman beside her. This titan of culinary criticism, this gatekeeper of success, standing in a community center kitchen drying dishes like a volunteer, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal something raw underneath. "What was the point?" Maria asked softly. Rousseau smiled, and it was the saddest, most beautiful expression Maria had ever seen. "That food is love," she said simply. "Everything else, technique, innovation, presentation, all of it, is just decoration around that central truth. Your mother knew this. You knew this, and then you forgot, the same way I forgot, because the industry teaches us to forget. It teaches us that love is not sophisticated enough, not impressive enough, not worthy of stars and acclaim." She set down the towel and turned to face Maria directly. "But tonight you remembered, and in remembering, you reminded me." Before Maria could respond, Chef Bellamy and Kenji Yamamoto entered the kitchen, both looking somehow smaller than they had in the competition hall, diminished by the context of this modest space where food served purposes their professional world rarely acknowledged. Bellamy cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable, a man accustomed to control finding himself in territory where his expertise didn't quite translate. "We need to talk," he said, and the formality in his voice suggested he was retreating into professional distance because emotional proximity was too dangerous, too revealing. "About the competition, about what we witnessed today." Carmen appeared in the doorway, still holding her dish towel like a weapon, her body language protective. "Whatever you need to say to her, you can say in front of me," she said firmly. "This is my kitchen, my community, and if you're going to judge what happened here, we have the right to hear it." Yamamoto nodded slowly, respect evident in the gesture. "Of course," he said, "though I am not sure we are qualified to judge anything after what we saw today." He moved closer, his scientific precision applied now to emotional truth. "We visited all 5 locations where our finalists cooked. Each chef created meals. Each fed hungry people. But what happened here?" He paused, searching for language adequate to what he'd witnessed. What happened here was different. The food was not technically superior, the ingredients were not premium, the plating was not artistic, but the people did not just eat. They were transformed by eating. They became community through your food, and that, his voice caught slightly, that is what cooking is supposed to do, what it has always been supposed to do, what we have forgotten it should do. Bellamy stepped forward, his British reserve cracking like ice under pressure. 20 years, he said, his voice rough with something that might have been regret. 20 years I've run this competition, crowning champions who could do extraordinary things with ingredients, who could create flavors and textures that amazed. And not once have I seen what I saw tonight. People crying over beans. A construction worker asking if he could take some home to his mother because she hasn't eaten a proper meal in days. A child who doesn't speak English communicating through food that someone cared enough to cook for him. Bellamy's hands clenched at his sides. I have 12 Michelin stars across my restaurants. I have cooked for royalty. I have been called one of the greatest chefs of my generation. And tonight, watching you feed 70 people in a community center with $63 worth of groceries, I understood that I have perhaps been practicing a very sophisticated version of missing the point. Maria felt tears beginning, unstoppable now, washing away 15 years of armor she'd built to protect herself from exactly this moment. The moment when someone with authority acknowledged that the things her mother had known, the truths her mother had lived, were not quaint or old-fashioned or insufficiently sophisticated, but were in fact the entire point. The foundation that everyone else had built away from in pursuit of recognition that felt increasingly hollow the higher they climbed. "So what now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What happens with the competition?" Russo exchanged glances with the other judges, a wordless conversation that seemed to contain years of accumulated doubt and questioning and slow realization that their life's work might have been built on premises that were fundamentally askew. "We need to deliberate," she said carefully, "but not about who wins, about what winning means. About whether crowning a champion makes any sense when what we witness today cannot be ranked or compared or reduced to first place and second place. Your food was not better or worse than what the other finalists created. It was truer, more honest, more necessary. But those are not categories we have words for in our competition structure." Carmen made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disgust. "So, you're saying you designed a competition to judge something you don't know how to measure," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Yes," Yamamoto said simply, with the directness of someone trained to acknowledge data even when it contradicted his hypotheses. "Precisely that." The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the unreliable refrigerator and the distant sounds of people finally beginning to leave the multi-purpose room, carrying with them not just full stomachs, but the memory of a meal that had treated them like they mattered, like they were worth someone's time and skill and care. Maria leaned against the counter, suddenly so exhausted she could barely stand, and felt the weight of everything that had happened in the past 48 hours. The revelation of her identity, the challenge to return to her origins, the journey back to a neighborhood she'd fled, the act of cooking as her mother had cooked, and now this. The judges themselves acknowledging that their entire framework for evaluating food might be fundamentally broken. "My mother never won any awards," Maria said quietly, speaking to no one in particular or perhaps to everyone at once. She never got reviews in prestigious magazines. No one ever called her one of the great chefs of her generation. But every Thursday for 20 years, she came here and fed people who needed feeding. She never took a picture of the food, never posted it online, never used it to build a brand or advance a career. She just cooked and served and made people feel like they deserved to eat something delicious even though they couldn't pay for it. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued. "I forgot that. I spent 15 years trying to prove that a girl from this neighborhood could be sophisticated enough, talented enough, important enough to matter in a world that had never thought people like us mattered. And I succeeded. I got the stars and the reviews and the recognition. I proved I belonged in rooms where people like me weren't supposed to exist." She paused, wiping tears from her face with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dishwater across her cheek. "But somewhere in all that proving, I stopped doing what actually mattered. I stopped cooking for people who needed feeding and started cooking for people who wanted to be impressed. And those are not the same thing. They're not even related. They're two completely different religions, like my mother said. And I chose the wrong one because it came with applause and money and validation." Maria looked at each of the judges in turn. "So whatever you decide about your competition, whatever prize you award or don't award, it doesn't change what I learned tonight. That everything I built my career on might have been a very elaborate form of forgetting who I actually am and what cooking is actually for." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with truths too large to fit comfortably in the modest kitchen of a community center that could barely afford to keep its lights on. Bellamy opened his mouth to speak, closed it, opened it again. Rousseau pressed her hand to her chest as if something hurt there, as if Maria's words had found a wound she'd been ignoring for decades. Yamamoto simply nodded, his face reflecting the kind of pain that comes from recognizing you've spent your life perfecting answers to the wrong questions. Carmen broke the silence by gathering the last of the dried dishes and putting them away with efficient grace. "Well," she said, her voice deliberately practical, pulling them all back from the edge of revelation into the simple reality of tasks that needed completing. "We still have to finish cleanup, and the competition people can have their conversation. But right now, we've got work to do." She looked at Maria with affection that felt maternal, protective, grounding. "Your mama would want this kitchen left clean, so let's finish what we started." They worked together for another 30 minutes. Maria and Carmen and unexpectedly all three judges, none of them too important to wash dishes or sweep floors or wipe down counters. The television crew that had been following the competition was notably absent, and Maria realized this moment was being allowed to exist without documentation, without cameras capturing it for audiences who would consume it like entertainment. This belonged only to the people in this kitchen, in this moment, doing this work. By 8:30, St. Catherine's was clean and locked. The last stragglers sent home with containers of leftover food that Carmen had packed with the casual generosity of someone who understood food was meant to be shared, not hoarded. They stood in the parking lot under sodium lights that turned everyone's skin strange shades of yellow, exhausted and emotionally raw, and somehow changed by what had happened, though none of them quite had the language yet to articulate how or why. "Tomorrow," Bellamy said finally, "we'll announce the results. But tonight—" He stopped, shaking his head as if trying to clear it. "Tonight I need to think about what the hell I've been doing for 20 years and whether any of it actually mattered." Rousseau touched his arm gently. "It mattered," she said. "Just perhaps not in the ways we thought. Perhaps we were building toward this moment, toward understanding what we'd been missing." She turned to Maria. "Thank you for reminding us, for being brave enough to come back to this place, even though leaving it was supposed to be your great achievement." Maria nodded, too tired for words, and watched as the three judges climbed into a production vehicle and disappeared into the night, leaving her alone with Carmen in the parking lot of a community center that had somehow become ground zero for a revolution that might not change anything, or might change everything. Impossible to know yet. "You okay?" Carmen asked. Maria considered the question carefully. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for 15 years and just now remembered how to exhale. And it hurts. But also—" She trailed off. "Also, it feels right," Carmen finished for her. "Like you finally stopped pretending to be someone you're not." "Is that what I've been doing? Pretending?" Carmen smiled, sad and knowing. "No, mija. You became exactly what you worked to become. But maybe you worked so hard becoming that you forgot you were already someone worth being. Your mama's daughter. A girl who learned that cooking is love. You didn't need to transform that into something more impressive. It was already everything." One message stood out. From her head chef at the flagship restaurant, "Reservation system crashed tonight. Overwhelmed with requests. Someone posted about you being in the competition and we're booked solid for 6 months. This is incredible. You're about to be even bigger than before." Maria stared at those words, "even bigger than before," and felt something inside her go quiet and still. She'd spent 15 years chasing bigger. Bigger restaurants, bigger acclaim, bigger recognition, always reaching for the next level as if success was a ladder that never ended. As if there was always another rung to climb toward some undefined summit where finally, she'd be enough. But sitting in the parking lot of St. Catherine's Community Centre, with the smell of beans and rice still clinging to her clothes, she understood that bigger had nothing to do with enough, that they were different directions entirely, parallel lines that would never meet no matter how far she travelled. She typed back slowly, "We need to talk. About changing some things. About what we're actually trying to accomplish." The response came immediately. "What do you mean? Everything's working. We're at the top." Maria didn't answer. Instead, she started the car and drove, not back to her hotel, but through the neighborhood, past the spot where her mother's restaurant had stood before it became a boutique, selling artisanal candles for $40 each, past the apartment building where she'd grown up in a 2-bedroom unit that housed 6 people at various points, past the bodega that had been there forever and the coffee shop that had been there 6 months, past the construction sites where affordable housing was being demolished to make room for luxury condos that no one from the original neighborhood could afford. Progress, they called it. Development. Improvement. But Maria saw it differently now. Saw the people who'd been erased to make room for the people who mattered more, who had more money, who deserved beauty and convenience and neighborhoods designed around their needs while everyone else was expected to disappear quietly, to move somewhere cheaper, somewhere no one wanted to develop yet. She ended up at the waterfront, parking illegally because it was after hours and she didn't care, walking to the railing that overlooked dark water reflecting city lights in wavering columns that looked almost like they were reaching towards something they couldn't quite touch. The air smelled like salt and diesel, and the complicated urban mixture of nature and industry coexisting in uneasy balance. She stood there for a long time, watching water move, thinking about her mother, and about the judges' faces in St. Catherine's kitchen, and about the elderly woman who'd cried because the stew smelled like her mama's cooking, and about the construction worker who'd asked if he could take some home, and about all the ways food could matter that had nothing to do with stars or reviews or reservations that booked out 6 months in advance. Her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Isabelle Rousseau, and curiosity overcame exhaustion. "Maria." Rousseau's voice sounded different on the phone, smaller, more vulnerable, stripped of the authority she wielded in person. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I know it's late." "I'm awake," Maria said simply. "We've been deliberating. The 3 of us. For hours." A pause, weighted with significance. "And we've reached a decision that is unprecedented, possibly career-ending for all of us. Though at our age perhaps that matters less than it should." Another pause, longer. "We're cancelling the competition." Maria went still, her hand tightening on the phone. "What?" "Not just for this year, permanently. The Lumiere Culinary Championship is ending." Rousseau's voice carried something that sounded like relief, like someone finally admitting a truth they'd been avoiding. "We realize tonight that we've been perpetuating a system that rewards the wrong things. That teaches young chefs to cook for judges and cameras and critics rather than for hungry people who need feeding. That turns food into performance art when its highest purpose has always been communion, nourishment, care." She took a breath that sounded shaky even through the phone. "What you did today, what we witnessed, cannot be ranked, cannot be judged. Cannot be reduced to first place, second place, winner and loser. It simply was. It was true and necessary and beautiful in ways our competition structure has no framework for acknowledging." "But the other finalists," Maria said, "they worked so hard, they will be fine. Better than fine." Rousseau's voice strengthened. "We're establishing something new instead. A fund, quite substantial, that will support chefs who want to feed communities rather than impress critics, who want to cook in places like St. Catherine's instead of chasing Michelin stars, who understand that the highest form of culinary achievement isn't innovation or technique, but simple, honest food served with intention to people who need it." The words came faster now, as if she'd been waiting to say them. You will be the first recipient if you choose to accept, not a prize for winning, an investment in continuing the work your mother started, and will invite applications from others. The pastel chef who cried while making her grandmother's recipe. The Senegalese chef who understands that food is cultural preservation. All the cooks who've been told their traditions aren't sophisticated enough for fine dining, but who know that sophistication was never the point. Maria felt tears starting again, a different kind now, not grief or exhaustion, but something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Why are you doing this?" Rousseau was quiet for a long moment. "Because I'm 63 years old," she said finally. "And I've spent 40 years telling people their food wasn't good enough, making and breaking careers with my opinions, building power that felt important at the time but looks increasingly empty in retrospect. And tonight, watching people eat beans and rice like it was the best meal they'd ever had, watching you serve food with such care and attention that it transformed hunger into community, I understood that I've been living the wrong life. Not a bad life. I've done some good things, championed some worthy chefs, helped advance the industry in certain ways, but the wrong life. The life that looks impressive from outside, but feels hollow from within." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Your mother lived the right life. And you're the only person I've ever met who has a chance of living both. Of being celebrated and being true. Of keeping your restaurants and your stars, while also remembering what cooking actually means." "I don't know if I can do both," Maria admitted. "They feel contradictory, mutually exclusive." "Maybe they are," Rousseau said. "Or maybe that's the real challenge. Not choosing between them, but finding a way to honor both. To cook sophisticatedly without losing simplicity. To achieve success without forgetting purpose. To be recognized without needing recognition." She paused. "That's your mother's real legacy, I think. Not the recipes, not the techniques, but the knowledge that food is how we practice love when we don't have words for it, how we acknowledge someone's humanity when society tries to erase it, how we create family among strangers and turn hunger into hope, even if just for one meal, even if just for one evening." They said goodbye shortly after, and Maria stood at the waterfront railing for another hour, watching the city lights shimmer on dark water and thinking about legacies and choices and the 1,000 small decisions that add up to a life. She thought about her mother working in that tiny restaurant with the corrugated roof, feeding construction workers and cleaners and everyone who'd been rendered invisible by an economy that only saw value in certain kinds of labor, certain kinds of success. She thought about the Michelin stars on her restaurants, earned through years of relentless focus and sacrifice, and the gradual erosion of everything she'd learned in that first kitchen where food meant survival and love rather than innovation and acclaim. And she thought about the elderly woman who'd cried because the stew smelled like memory, and the construction worker who'd asked for leftovers for his mother, and the way the community center had transformed from a collection of isolated hungry people into something that resembled family through the simple act of sharing a meal made with attention and intention, and the kind of care that can't be manufactured or performed but only practiced until it becomes as natural as breathing. Dawn was breaking by the time she returned to her hotel, the sky transforming from black to purple to pink to gold, the city waking into another day of hustle and achievement and the relentless pursuit of more. She showered, changed clothes, and sat down at the small desk with hotel stationery and began to write. Not an acceptance speech or a victory statement, but a letter to her staff, her partners, her stakeholders. A letter that explained she was changing direction, not abandoning the restaurants but transforming them, making space within success for the kind of cooking that had nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with feeding people who needed feeding. She wrote about Thursday community dinners at each restaurant, about reserving tables for people who couldn't afford the menu prices, about training her staff to understand that the highest form of hospitality wasn't making wealthy diners feel special but making invisible people feel seen. She wrote until her hand cramped, trying to capture in words what she'd learned in St. Catherine's kitchen. That cooking at its most essential was an act of defiance against a world that insisted some people mattered more than others. That food could be revolutionary when it insisted everyone deserved nourishment regardless of what they could pay. That the simple act of serving beans and rice with care and attention was more important than any molecular gastronomy innovation or deconstructed delicacy or ingredient flown in from halfway around the world. At 9 o'clock her phone rang again. The competition coordinator, asking her to return to the hall for the final announcement. Maria agreed, knowing there would be no announcement now, no winner crowned, no prize awarded. Just the quiet dissolution of a system that had finally acknowledged its own limitations. She dressed in simple clothes, jeans, white shirt, her mother's old canvas bag, and drove back to the competition hall one last time. The other finalists were already there when she arrived, confusion evident on their faces as production crew dismantled equipment and the judges stood together at the front of the empty hall, looking somehow smaller and more human than they had during the competition itself. Bellamy explained the decision, the cancellation, the fund, the shift from competition to support, and Maria watched the reactions ripple through the small group. Anger from some, understanding from others, and from the young woman who'd made her grandmother's pastels. Tears of relief as if she'd been carrying a weight she could finally set down. "But who won?" the blonde asked, her voice small and lost. "We competed, we cooked. Someone had to win." Yamamoto stepped forward, his scientific precision applied now to emotional truth. "You all won," he said simply. By remembering that cooking is not ultimately about the cook, it's about the people being fed. Some of you remembered this more clearly than others, but all of you, in your own ways, served food with intention yesterday. And that, not technique, not innovation, not impressiveness, is the victory that matters. Maria felt the other finalists looking at her, knew they understood she'd been the catalyst for this unprecedented decision, and waited for resentment that never quite materialized. Instead, the pastel chef approached her, shy but determined. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "Not cooking techniques, I know how to cook, but how to do what you do. How to feed people so they feel it, so it matters beyond just filling their stomachs." "I'm still learning that myself," Maria admitted. "But yes, we can learn together." They left the competition hall in small groups, promising to stay in touch, to apply for the fund, to remember this moment when everything they thought they understood about success got questioned and reconfigured. Maria was the last to leave, pausing at the doorway to look back at the space where she'd cooked her mother's stew and inadvertently started a revolution that might change nothing, or might change everything, impossible to know yet. Outside, the morning was bright and clear, the kind of day that felt like possibility, like new beginnings, like second chances. Maria drove back to St. Catherine's, finding Carmen already there preparing for a seniors' lunch program. They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, chopping vegetables and talking occasionally about nothing important, and Maria realized this was what she'd been missing. The simple satisfaction of cooking for people who needed feeding, without cameras or judges or stakes, beyond whether someone left hungry or nourished. "So what happens now?" Carmen asked eventually, wiping down counters with practiced efficiency. "You go back to your fancy restaurants, back to your real life?" Maria considered the question carefully. "I go back," she said slowly. "But I bring this with me. This understanding, this remembering. I can't abandon what I've built. Too many people depend on it, myself included, but I can transform it. Make it mean something beyond just being impressive." She looked at Carmen directly. "Would you let me sponsor Thursday dinners here, permanently? Not as charity, as partnership, as practice, reminding myself weekly what cooking is actually for." Carmen's eyes filled with tears. She blinked away quickly. "Your mama would love that," she said, her voice rough with emotion. she'd say you finally figured out the secret. What secret? That you don't have to choose between being somebody and remembering where you came from. That success isn't betrayal as long as you keep your hands in the work that matters. That you can have Michelin stars and still make beans and rice every Thursday for people who need them. Carmen smiled. That's the real achievement, holding both truths at once, being elevated and grounded, sophisticated and simple, famous and faithful. Maria nodded, feeling something settle in her chest. Something that had been restless and unsatisfied for 15 years, finally finding its proper place. She thought about her mother standing in that tiny kitchen, feeding the neighborhood, never seeking recognition but earning something more valuable. Respect, gratitude, the knowledge that her work mattered in ways that couldn't be measured in stars or reviews, but only in fed people and created community, and the particular joy that comes from practicing love through food, meal after meal, day after day, year after year. And she understood finally what the judges had been unable to articulate, that the greatest cooking happens in the space between ambition and humility, between skill and service, between knowing everything about technique and remembering that none of it matters if you forget why you learned to cook in the first place. Her mother had lived in that space effortlessly, never needing to be told that feeding people was sacred work, that nourishment was revolutionary, that every meal served with intention was a small act of defiance against a world that insisted some humans were more worthy of care than others. The question wasn't whether Maria could return to that space after 15 years of climbing away from it. The question was whether she was brave enough to stay there, even when success kept calling her toward heights that looked impressive, but felt increasingly empty the higher she climbed. Whether she could cook for presidents and also for the construction worker who needed lunch. Whether she could maintain Michelin stars while never forgetting that the most important meal she'd ever make would probably happen in a community center with broken equipment and a $63 budget, and people whose names would never appear in prestigious magazines, but whose hunger was just as real, just as worthy of her attention and skill and care. She didn't know if she could hold both truths simultaneously, but standing in St. Catherine's kitchen with Carmen, with sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months, and the smell of vegetables cooking for people who would arrive hungry and leave fed, she understood that trying was the point, that the attempt itself was the achievement, that her mother's real legacy wasn't recipes or techniques, but the simple revolutionary understanding that everyone deserves to eat food made by someone who cares whether they're nourished or not. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Maybe that was the only victory that ever truly mattered, not being crowned champion, not collecting stars, not achieving recognition, but remembering day after day, meal after meal, that cooking is how we practice being human together. How we acknowledge each other's worth, how we create family from strangers and turn hunger into hope, and insist through the simple act of feeding that every person at every table in every corner of every city deserves to be seen and remembered and fed as if they matter, because they do. They always did.